I spent 3 weeks on Thatcher Island off the coast of Maine, and I broke a rule I didn't know existed. The locals never told me what would happen if I crossed the wrong property line after sunset. They just said, "Don't." I thought they meant bears, maybe coyotes. I was wrong. The rental cottage sat on the eastern shore, surrounded by pine trees that blocked most of the afternoon light. I booked the place without even seeing it first, hoping the isolation would help me finish the second book I was writing. No cell service, no internet, just me, my laptop, a half-finished draft, and the sound of waves hitting the rocks like a metronome. The man who owned the property, Mr. Dalton, met me on the first day. He showed me where the propane tanks were, how to work the ancient water heater, and then he paused at the door. "Stay on the main paths after dark," he said. "Don't cut through the woods between here and the western ridge." I asked why. He looked at me intensely. "Just don't," he repeated. I nodded, smiled, figured it was one of those island superstitions that locals told renters to keep them from wandering into private land or disturbing wildlife. I'd grown up in Montana. I knew how to respect nature, but I didn't know anything about the boundaries people draw when they've lived somewhere for generations. The first 2 weeks gave me no reason to worry. I worked during the day, walked the beach at dusk, cooked simple meals on the gas stove. The island had maybe 40 year-round residents, most of them clustered near the small harbor on the southern tip. I saw them occasionally at the general store, a wooden building that sold canned goods and fishing supplies. They were polite but kept their distance, the kind of people who measure newcomers in years, not days. I kept to myself, kept to the paths. Then my laptop died. The battery just gave out, wouldn't charge, wouldn't turn on. I had 2 chapters left to write and 3 weeks of research that existed only on that hard drive. I'd backed up most of it to a cloud server before coming to the island, but the final interviews, the new data, all of it was trapped in dead silicon. The general store didn't sell electronics. The woman behind the counter, younger than Mr. Dalton but with the same cautious eyes, told me there was a guy on the western part of the island who fixed things. Cameras, radios mostly. Sometimes computers. His name was Pike. She gave me rough directions. "Take the main road west until you see the old chapel," she said. "Turn left. His place is another quarter-mile past the Hendry property." I asked if I should call ahead. She shook her head. "No phones out there. Just show up before 5. He doesn't like visitors after dark." I left at 3, giving myself plenty of time. The walk took longer than I expected. The main road was barely a road, more like 2 tire ruts, separated by a strip of wild grass. The chapel she'd mentioned was a small wooden structure with a collapsed roof, swallowed by blackberry bushes. I turned left onto an even narrower path. The trees changed here. Thicker, older. I passed a rusted mailbox with no name, then a chain across a driveway, with a no trespassing sign so faded I could barely read it. Pike's place was a trailer with a satellite dish and a workshed out back. He was maybe 50, with a gray beard and hands stained black from engine grease. I greeted him and tried to use small talk to ask him some questions about the island. He answered plainly, but didn't ask much questions himself, just took my laptop and said he'd look at it. "Come back tomorrow," he said. I thanked him and started walking back. I hadn't noticed how much time had passed until then. The sky had that gray look it gets, right before night takes over. I'd spent longer at Pike's than I thought, watching him disassemble the laptop, explaining the problem. Now the trees were shadows, and the path was harder to see. I walked faster. But somewhere between the collapsed chapel and the main road, I took a wrong turn. I didn't realize it immediately. The path looked right. Same tire ruts. Same overgrown grass. But after 10 minutes, I should have reached the road. Instead, I found myself in a clearing I didn't recognize. 3 structures stood in a rough triangle. Not houses, more like hunting cabins, dark and shuttered. In the center of the clearing was a stone marker, waist high, with words carved into it that I couldn't read in the failing light. I pulled out my phone for the flashlight. No service, but the light still worked. I aimed it at the stone. Hendry, 1894. Boundary held. I stood there, trying to understand what I was looking at. A property marker? A grave? Then, The sound of footsteps broke the silence. Not animal footsteps. Human, coming from the woods to my left. I turned off the flashlight, stood completely still. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then a voice. Low, male, talking to someone I couldn't see. "He's in the clearing," the voice said. A pause. "No, just standing there." Another pause. Longer. I started backing away, slowly, trying not to make sound. My hand found a tree trunk. I moved around it, keeping the bulk of the wood between me and wherever that voice was coming from. The footsteps started again. Closer. I ran. I didn't know where I was going. Just away. Branches whipped my face. Roots tried to trip me. I kept the phone flashlight off, navigating by the bare minimum of twilight still filtering through the canopy. Behind me, I could hear them. Plural now. At least 2 sets of footsteps, maybe 3, moving through the forest with the confidence of people who knew every inch of this land. I crashed through underbrush, stumbled down a small embankment, landed hard on packed dirt. A road. The main road. I ran west, toward where I thought the cottage was, lungs burning. The footsteps didn't follow onto the road. They stopped at the tree line, but I could feel them watching. I made it back to the cottage 40 minutes later, legs shaking, clothes torn. I locked every door, every window. Sat in the dark because turning on lights felt like announcing my presence. Around midnight, I heard a truck. Slow, driving past the cottage, then back again. Then it drove away. The next morning, I found something on my doorstep. A photograph. Old. Faded. Showing the same clearing I'd stumbled into, but in daylight. In the photo, I could see what I'd missed in the dark. The 3 cabins formed a triangle, yes. But between them, connecting them, were ropes. And hanging from those ropes. My hands started shaking before I could fully process what I was seeing. I turned the photo over. On the back, written in pencil, "Some boundaries aren't about land." I didn't go back for my laptop. I packed what I could carry and walked to the harbor that same morning. There was a mail boat that ran supplies twice a week. The captain didn't ask why I was leaving early. He just took my cash and pointed to a bench on the deck. As we pulled away from the dock, I saw Mr. Dalton standing on the wharf. He didn't wave, just watched me go with a blank expression. Relief, maybe, or disappointment that I'd learned something I wasn't supposed to. I never found out what those ropes were holding in that photograph. I never learned what the Hendry boundary actually marked, or why people still enforced it after more than a century. What I did learn was this: the locals hadn't warned me about wildlife. They'd warned me about something older, something that had roots deeper than any tree on that island. 2 months later, I got a package at my apartment in Montana. Inside was my laptop, fully repaired, and a note from Pike. "Works fine now. Don't come back." The hard drive was wiped clean. Every file, every interview, 3 years of research, gone. But there was one new folder on the desktop. Just one, named Clearing. I never opened it. Sometimes I wonder if I actually broke a boundary that night, or if I was always meant to find that clearing. If maybe the island has its own way of deciding who stays and who leaves, who gets to know and who gets to forget. I think about those footsteps in the dark, how they knew exactly where I was, how they stopped at the road like there was an invisible line they wouldn't cross. Because boundaries aren't just about keeping people out. Sometimes they're about keeping something in, and I think whatever I stumbled into that night, it's still there, still waiting, still marking territory that no map will ever show. The locals know. They've always known. I just wish someone had told me what happens when you finally understand why. I learned something on that remote island off the coast of Alaska. When one person holds your only way out, you're not a visitor anymore. You're a captive waiting to be released. The island didn't have a name on most maps. Locals called it Whitlow Point. Population, 47 during summer, maybe 20 in winter. I went there in February of 2022 to finish writing my thesis, thinking isolation would help me focus. I rented a cabin from a woman named Mrs. Kelso for 3 months. She warned me about the ferry schedule. It only came twice a month during off-season. But she also told me about Samuel Brigg. Samuel owned the only functional boat on Whitlow Point. He was a fisherman, maybe 60 years old, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from driftwood. The other boats on the island were either rotting at the docks or missing engines. Samuel's vessel was a 30-foot fishing rig called the Clearing. He used it for his work, but he also transported people to the mainland for emergencies or supplies. $50 one way. Cash only. I met him my second day there. He was sorting nets on the dock, and I introduced myself, explaining I'd be there for a while. He barely looked up, just nodded and said if I ever needed to get off before the ferry came, I knew where to find him. Simple enough. The first month passed without incident. I wrote. I walked the beaches. I bought groceries from the only store, a place that smelled like rust and old coffee. The island had a stillness that felt sacred at first. No cell service except near the community center. No internet in my cabin. Just wind and waves and silence. I started taking my laptop to the community center to upload research files. That's where I met Samuel's son, Warren. Warren was different from his father. Talkative. Friendly in a way that felt almost desperate. He told me Samuel had been running that boat for 30 years. That Samuel knew these waters better than anyone alive. That people respected him because he'd saved lives during storms, pulled families off the island when medical emergencies hit. But Warren also mentioned something else. He said his father didn't forget slights. I didn't think much of it then. The trouble started in my 7th week. I was at the store when Samuel came in to buy fuel. The owner, a guy named Dutch, was arguing with him about payment for a previous trip. Apparently Samuel had taken Dutch's nephew to the mainland 2 weeks prior, and Dutch was insisting he'd already paid. Samuel disagreed. Their voices rose. Dutch called Samuel a liar. Samuel went quiet in a way that made the whole store feel smaller. Then he turned and walked out without another word. I was paying for bread when Dutch muttered something under his breath about Samuel being a greedy bastard. I didn't say anything, but I guess I smiled. Just a reflex, a nervous reaction to the tension. Samuel was standing right outside the window. He saw me. Our eyes met for maybe 2 seconds. Then he walked away. I didn't think he'd care. I didn't think it mattered. But 3 days later, I needed to get to the mainland. My advisor had scheduled an emergency meeting, and I couldn't do it over the spotty community center Wi-Fi. The ferry wasn't coming for another 10 days. I went to find Samuel. His house was a gray structure near the north docks, surrounded by stacked crab pots and buoys. I knocked. Waited. Knocked again. Warren answered. I asked if Samuel could take me across. Warren's expression shifted into something uncomfortable. He said his father was busy. I offered $75. Warren shook his head, said Samuel wasn't taking passengers right now. I asked when he'd be available. Warren just closed the door. Over the next week, I tried more than 4 times. I left notes on Samuel's boat. I waited at the docks. I even asked Mrs. Kelso to intervene. She told me Samuel was stubborn as a stone, and if he'd decided something, there was no changing it. The ferry finally came. I made my meeting late via a rescheduled video call at the community center. But something had shifted. I realized the shape of my situation. There was no Uber, no water taxi service, no Coast Guard station for non-emergencies. Samuel's boat was it, and Samuel had decided I wasn't welcome on it. The second month became a countdown. Every day I watched the docks. Samuel went out fishing like clockwork. He transported other people. I saw him take the schoolteacher to the mainland, saw him bring back supplies for the store. But when I approached, he looked through me like I was fog. By mid-March, I started having dreams about being stuck there forever. The island began to feel like it was shrinking. The cabin walls seemed closer each morning. I researched swimming distances. I considered building a raft. I knew these were irrational thoughts, but rationality doesn't hold up well under isolation. Then Warren came to my cabin. It was late, almost 11. He looked afraid. He told me his father had asked about me that evening, asked how long I was planning to stay. Warren said there was something off in the way Samuel asked, something that made Warren think I should be careful. I asked what he meant. Warren said the island had a history, that 20 years ago, a journalist came to write about the community. He'd upset someone, took photos he wasn't supposed to take. His cabin burned down one night, while he was sleeping. He survived, but barely. The ferry was scheduled to arrive in 4 days. I didn't leave the cabin except for necessities. I kept the lights off at night. I watched the tree line for movement. On the third night, I woke to the smell of gasoline. Not inside. Outside. I went to the window and saw a shape near the woodpile. Too dark to make out details. But I knew. The next morning, there were footprints in the mud around my cabin. Large boots. Leading to the door. Leading to the windows. Leading to where I'd parked Mrs. Kelso's old truck. The ferry came the following afternoon. I packed everything in 20 minutes and waited at the dock 3 hours early. When the boat finally appeared on the horizon, I started breathing normally for the first time in days. Samuel was there too, watching from his vessel. As I boarded the ferry, he raised one hand. Not a wave, just an acknowledgement. I left Whitlow Point that day. But this is what I can't stop thinking about. Mrs. Kelso called me 3 months later. She said someone had been asking about me. Wanted to know if I'd left anything behind. Wanted to know if I'd ever mentioned coming back. It was Samuel, and apparently, he'd just bought a second boat. I didn't call Mrs. Kelso back for almost 2 weeks. When I finally did, I asked why Samuel would buy a second boat. She said something that made my hands go cold. The second boat wasn't for fishing. It was a passenger vessel, small but legitimate. Samuel had registered it with the state. He was advertising transport services to neighboring islands. Islands I'd never heard of during my stay. Islands that didn't have ferry service at all. Mrs. Kelso said people were moving to those places now. Remote workers, writers, people like me, looking for isolation and quiet. Samuel had positioned himself as their only reliable connection to the mainland. I asked if anyone had complained about him, if anyone had issues getting back. She hesitated. Then she said 2 people had extended their stays unexpectedly last summer. Both had planned to leave after a month, but ended up staying 3. When they finally returned to the mainland, they didn't talk much about why they'd stayed longer. But one of them, a woman from Oregon, had lost a significant amount of weight. Looked exhausted. Kept glancing over her shoulder at the docks. I wanted to ask more, but Mrs. Kelso said she had to go. Before she hung up, she mentioned one last thing. Samuel had asked for my forwarding address. Said he had something of mine. Something I'd left in the cabin. I never left anything behind. I checked and rechecked before I boarded that ferry. Mrs. Kelso said she didn't give him my information. But then she asked a question that I still can't answer. She asked if I'd posted anything online about Whitlow Point. Any photos. Any reviews. Anything with location tags. I had. A single Instagram post from my first week there. Beautiful sunset over the docks. Caption about finding peace in remote places. 43 people liked it. My mind told me it didn't mean anything, but I didn't want to take any chances. I deleted my account that same hour. 2 months after that conversation, I found out Warren had left Whitlow Point. Just disappeared one morning. Took nothing with him. The last person who saw him was Samuel. They'd been working on the new boat together the night before. I still write. I still go looking for some peace and quiet, every now and then. But I never go anywhere that has a single point of failure anymore. And I never smile at the wrong moment. Because some people don't forget. They just wait. And sometimes, they expand. If these stories are creeping you out, subscribe. The horror isn't over. I went to Morrow Island because I needed silence. Real silence. The kind you can't find anymore in places that are still kind of connected to the outside world. This was October of 2022, and I'd spent 6 months listening to sirens and car alarms and arguments through paper-thin apartment walls. My therapist said I needed a reset. A friend mentioned this tiny fishing community off the Washington coast, accessible only by ferry twice a week. The crossing took 3 hours through fog so thick the captain navigated purely by instruments. When I stepped off onto the weathered dock, I noticed something odd right away. The harbormaster's office stood wide open, door propped back with a brick, even though the wind was picking up and rain looked inevitable. I peeked inside, thinking maybe someone was working, but the place was empty. Coffee still steaming on the desk. Wallet and keys sitting right there on the counter. I found the rental cabin easily enough. Mrs. Holland, who owned it, was waiting on the porch, hands deep in her cardigan pockets. She handed me a single key attached to a piece of driftwood. "For emergencies," she said, "though you won't need it." I asked what she meant. "We don't lock doors here. Haven't in generations. Nothing bad happens on Morrow Island." She said it with absolute certainty, the way someone might say the sun rises in the east. The cabin was small but clean. Wood stove in the corner, narrow bed against the wall, kitchen barely big enough to turn around in. What caught my attention was the front door. No deadbolt, just a basic knob with a lock so old and stiff it barely turned. I tried it a few times, felt the mechanism grinding inside like it hadn't been used in years. That first evening, I walked the island's only real road. Past maybe a dozen houses. Every single door stood open or unlocked. I could see straight into living rooms. One place had a purse hanging on a coat rack right by the entrance. Another had a laptop open on a kitchen table, visible from the street. It felt wrong. Not charming or quaint. Wrong. I stopped by the island's general store before it closed. The owner, a man named Philip, with hands like catcher's mitts, was counting cash from the register, stacking it in neat piles right there on the counter where anyone could see. I mentioned it seemed unusual, the whole unlocked door situation. Philip smiled. "It has been this way long as anyone remembers. Island takes care of its own. You're safe here. Safer than anywhere else you've been, I'd wager." He said it casually, but it didn't land that way. That night, I left my door unlocked like everyone else. Tried to sleep. The silence I'd come looking for pressed against my ears until I could hear my own pulse. Around 2 a.m, I got up for water, looked out the window toward the nearest neighbor, maybe 200 yards away. Their lights were off. Front door standing open. Just a black rectangle leading into deeper black. I spent 3 days walking, reading, trying to decompress. But I kept noticing things. The way conversations would stop when I approached. How everyone was in bed by 9, lights out, doors open to the wind. I'd walk past houses late and see those dark entryways, and something about it made my throat tight. On the 4th night, the floorboard beside my bed creaked differently when I stepped on it. A hollow sound. I knelt down, worked my fingers into the gap, and pried it up. Underneath was a piece of paper, folded into a small square. Old paper, covered in handwriting that looked rushed. Panicked, even. It was a list. Rules. 7 of them. Number 1, after dark, keep your door unlocked and your lights off. Number 2, if you hear footsteps outside, do not look through the window. Number 3, if the footsteps stop at your door, do not acknowledge them. Number 4, if you hear breathing, pretend to be asleep. Number 5, do not scream. Do not run. Do not lock the door. Number 6, if you hear footsteps at night, do not lock the door. It means it already chose you. Number 7 was scratched out, completely illegible, like someone had dragged the pen back and forth until the paper nearly tore. My hands were shaking. I read it again, and again. The handwriting at the bottom was different. Looked like it had been added later. It said, "They know when you're new. Give them time to decide." I sat on the edge of the bed, holding this paper, trying to convince myself it was a prank, some local hazing ritual for tourists. But I kept thinking about those open doors. The perfect silence after 9. The way Philip had said I was safe here, but his eyes hadn't matched his smile. I don't know how long I sat there. Could have been 20 minutes. Could have been 2 hours. The gravel started crunching outside my door. One step at a time. Whoever it was coming directly up the path to my cabin. I looked at the door. Still unlocked. The key Mrs. Holland gave me was sitting on the kitchen counter, attached to that piece of driftwood. The footsteps got closer. Everything in my body screamed at me to lock that door, but I kept asking myself whether locking it would protect me or trap me. My muscles were already moving, carrying me toward it, hand reaching for the knob. I thought about the rules, about how everyone here lived with their doors open. I thought about what happens to people who don't follow rules they don't understand. My fingers touched the lock, and I twisted it. The click echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. For 3 seconds, there was absolute silence. Then something on the other side of the door began to knock. Not like a person asking to come in, like something finding weak points on the wood. The knocking got faster, harder. I backed away from the door, watching the handle start to turn. The handle turned slowly, testing the lock I'd just engaged. Then it stopped. The knocking stopped. Everything stopped. I stood there in the dark, barely breathing, waiting for the door to splinter inward. Instead, I heard something worse. Footsteps moving away from my door, circling the cabin. Slow and methodical, like whatever was out there was measuring the perimeter, counting the windows, learning the structure. Then they stopped at the back window, the one beside my bed. I couldn't see anything through the glass, just darkness and my own reflection, but I could feel it standing there, patient, waiting for me to break. Hours passed like that, with me frozen in the middle of the cabin, the presence outside completely still. When dawn finally came, the footsteps moved away, back down the gravel path. Gone. I didn't pack. I ran straight to the dock, hoping the ferry schedule had changed, knowing it hadn't. Mrs. Holland was there, sitting on a bench, watching the horizon. She looked at me with something like pity. "You locked it," she said. Not a question. I demanded to know what was happening, what I'd done. She spoke, and her voice sounded tired. Ancient. The island has something. Had it long before we came. We made our peace with it generations ago. It walks at night, chooses someone new every few years. If you leave your door open, follow the rules, it just looks, studies you, decides you're part of the community. But if you lock it out, she didn't finish. It takes that as a challenge, I whispered. She nodded. It'll come back. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. But it knows you now. Knows you're afraid. And fear. She looked at me then, really looked at me. Fear is like a beacon to it. The ferry arrived 2 days later. I didn't sleep those 48 hours. Just sat with my back against the wall, watching both doors, listening to footsteps that might have been real or might have been my imagination. When I finally left Morro Island, Mrs. Holland handed me something as I boarded. The rule list. The original one from under my floorboard. Might need this, she said. Distance doesn't matter much. Not once it's chosen. I live in Seattle now. 9th floor apartment. 3 locks on the door. But here's what I've learned about fear and safety, and the choices we make when we're terrified. Locks only work against things that respect boundaries. And some things don't need doors to find you. If you made it to the end, subscribe and turn on notifications. Some stories only find the people who are still here.